In this video I'll be explaining what would happen if we're going to World War III. World War III, often abbreviated to World War III or WW3, also known as the Third World War, the Final War, the War to End All Peace, the War to End All World Wars, or the Impossible War, was a global war that lasted between 2025 and 2032 while ending the so-called Long Peace of the Pax Americana. The vast majority of the world's nations, among them all nuclear powers, eventually formed two opposing alliances, the Allies and the revisionist powers. In a state of total war, more than almost 2 billion people from over 100 nations were mobilized, making WW3 the largest war in human history, surpassing its predecessor, WW2, with fighting occurring on every continent, including small operations against satellite stations in Antarctica. WW3 was also the most widespread war in history. The main participants threw their entire economic, industrial, and scientific capabilities behind the war effort, blurring the line between civilian and military resources. The Third World War was the deadliest event in the history of mankind, marked by 300 million casualties, including the victims of various war crimes, like the Uyghur and Kurdish genocides, the ethnic cleansing of Shias and Sunnis, the carpet bombing of the Gaza Strip, the massacres against the Crimean Tatarians, Kashmiri Muslims and Indians, Israelis, Tibetans, Ukrainians and Taiwanese, and many more. Millions more died in the years after the war, due to famine, disease, follow-up conflicts or the long-term effects of nuclear and chemical warfare. The war was marked by the extensive use of ballistic and cruise missiles, automated and autonomous weapons systems, cyber warfare, hypersonic weaponry and the use of chemical and nuclear weapons of mass destruction. It was the result of the Second Cold War, Sino-Russian expansionism, neo-imperialism, globalization, the Korea crisis, the Venezuela crisis, the proxy wars in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the economic crisis and socio-political conflicts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic 2020 to 2023, the Russo-Ukrainian War, Karabakh conflict, the rise of the AKP dictatorship in Turkey as well as U.S. foreign policy under the first and second term of Donald J. Trump and the term of Joseph R. Biden. The allies of WW3 were a Western-based alliance of some of the most powerful nations in the world, including the majority of the nuclear powers at that time. It was mainly composed by the members of NATO, the Saudi-led Arab coalition, Israel, the Asian powerhouses of India, Japan, and South Korea, as well as Australia and New Zealand, while later on many nations in Africa, and in both South and Central America joined as well. This alliance included most of the world's liberal democracies, which was why many allies shared a common set of fundamental values. This shared ideological basis received massive cracks though, since the alliance also included illiberal democracies, and even authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia. Many allied nations also experienced a democratic backsliding due to the global rise of authoritarianism and anti-liberalism in the years before the war. This undermined the unity of the Allies and led to the struggle the alliance had for keeping up with the revisionist powers. The unofficial leader of the Allies was the U.S. under the administration of Joseph R. Biden and later on Donald J. Trump, who gained a second term as president in 2024, while using emergency laws to prolong his presidency until 2031. North America, the United States of America was the main global hegemon of this time period, but struggled to maintain its status due to the rise of China and a resurgent Russia, leading to the tensions that caused WW3 in the first place. Under the first administration of Donald J. Trump, America saw a period of deep political division and the erosion of various fundamental political norms, while becoming increasingly anti-globalist and isolationist. Trump, who openly endorsed authoritarians worldwide, whilst boosting right-wing and conservative movements in the US and Europe, showed aggressive and erratic behavior against US allies out of his America First policy, effectively weakening NATO in the process. The US under Trump also withdrew from various international institutions and agreements, or cut their funding for them, like the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, NAFTA, the INF Treaty, UNESCO, the UN Migration Pact, the Open Skies Treaty, the WHO during the COVID-19 pandemic and many more, although Biden returned to several of those prior to WW3. Trump also engaged in various trade wars, not only against U.S. adversaries like China and nations like Mexico, but also U.S. allies like Japan, Canada, and Europe, calling the latter a foe of America. After the Mueller investigation did not find evidence for collusion between the Trump campaign of 2016 and Russia, and an impeachment attempt failed at the end of January 2020, the Republican president still managed to rally almost half of the U.S. behind his cause, although not achieving re-election in 2020, leading him to deny his defeat while questioning the legitimacy of the victory of his Democratic opponent, Joseph "Joe R. Biden." Biden tried to reverse the policy of his predecessor by seeking to re-engage in multilateralism and diplomacy, while trying to unite a deeply divided America. Biden was seen as a complete opposite of the Trump administration. He was widely seen as more favorable by American Democratic allies in Europe and Canada, while relying more on experts and experienced politicians during his presidency, which he always called as being purely transitional. He tried to distinguish himself from his predecessor also by taking a tougher stance against authoritarians and dictators worldwide, leading him to oppose Russia more offensively than Trump did, while continuing the increasingly belligerent course against China, although with a more diplomatic approach. Despite Biden's attempts at fighting the division of American society, the rifts in U.S. communities still remained high and encouraged Trump to follow an even more aggressive and anti-liberal re-election campaign for 2024, that led to a very hostile climate against Democrats, liberals, and the media, causing a rise of not only right-wing, but also left-wing extremism in the U.S. Biden, whose physical and cognitive health increasingly diminished in office due to old age, was also accused of projecting American weakness, for example through signaling that the U.S. would under no circumstance intervene should Russia invade American ally Ukraine, as did occur shortly after. In 2024, despite being found guilty of using party donations to pay hush money to a porn star, as well as sexual assault, Trump managed to win the election against Kamala Harris, who ran after Biden dropped out of the race in August 2024, due to his declining physical and cognitive health. Trump's re-election as U.S. president, which sent ripples throughout America and the world as a whole, due to a shift of balance of the Supreme Court, as well as both the Senate and Congress towards the conservative side, and unquestioned support of millions of his followers, the re-elected U.S. president of 2024 managed to rule America unopposed in a style close to pseudo-authoritarianism, allowing him to protect his political allies, marginalizing his enemies, while also being free of almost all legal consequences. Trump also retrieved a lot of U.S. forces from around the world, in what was later dubbed the Great Retreat, because he deemed overseas deployments as undesirable if the respective nations would not pay America for stationing troops inside their borders. This led the U.S. to pull out troops from Syria, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and in parts even Europe. Although Biden tried to stop or even reverse this process when he took office, this still led to a weakening America's positions as soon as the war broke out. Trump's aggressive behavior against his allies and adversaries alike, supported by his large base, also led to an increased global rise of anti-American sentiment during his first term. During the war, America was the main driving force behind the Allied war effort, while following its own agenda. While initially engaging in North Korea to stop the nuclear threat of the Kim regime, the U.S. later explained their war effort as a means to prevent Chinese, Iranian and Russian aggression, which threatened America's strategic, economic and military dominance. After 2025, Trump, following his America First policy, planned to utilize the war to crush any economic challengers of the U.S., while cementing America's status as the world's strongest superpower. During the course of the war, Trump and his subordinates even indirectly colluded with America's enemy Russia in order to reach their ambitions, meaning Trump knowingly neglected his European allies in their fight against Russia, hoping that Putin would crush the EU as an economic rival, while the U.S. could focus on defeating China and Iran. Many American soldiers, on the other hand, saw this war as a battle to protect the world against the ambitions of the revisionist powers for remodeling it in their authoritarian image. They firmly stood for their country, while some of the younger newly drafted recruits openly criticized Trump for his lack of strategy and commitment for America's allies and values. Trump's plan failed, and since he overfocused his forces on the Eastern Front, the US suffered horrendous casualties, due to the large armies that were concentrated in comparatively small areas of harsh terrain. Also, the US overstretched their forces on multiple fronts around the world, which dispersed America's strength as a whole. This led the US to lose half of all its troops it sent into the war, while also losing its most important military assets. America managed to achieve a marginal victory along with its allies by pushing China as the last revisionist power towards an armistice. This came after Europe consolidated and restructured itself independently from the US, which forced the Russians out of Allied territory, and pushed them out of the war. The result was a devastated America, that lost much of its military and economic strength, while also losing its most important partners after the intention of Trump's neglection to his European allies became public. The resulting turmoil led to the destabilization of the US and ultimately the Second American Civil War. Canada under Justin Trudeau joined the war as a NATO member after Canadian troops were attacked following the Russian invasion of the Baltics. During the course of that war, Canada proved to be committed to the alliance and supported the Europeans in Scandinavia and Poland against the revisionist powers. Canada was also the main ally who supported the US against the Russian invasion of the Aleutian Islands, Greenland, and in the battle against Mexico in the last phase of the war. Greenland on the other hand became involved in the war after the American Philly base on its territory was bombed by Russian submarines, later followed by a brief Russian invasion of the island. Europe, the allies of Europe mostly joined the war out of their NATO alliance with America, as well as ideological and self-defensive reasons. The majority of the continent, most of which were members of the EU, became part of the Allies, except Switzerland, the European microstates and Ireland, as well as the revisionist powers of Belarus and Serbia. Europe faced a time of division and crisis prior to WW3 due to the rise of anti-EU populism, Brexit, both right-wing and left-wing extremism and economic hardship after the COVID-19 pandemic and following the Ukraine war. While Europe struggled to maintain unity, tensions with other Eurasian countries started to increase. Simultaneously, especially with the Russian Federation, Russia was accused of performing various attacks against regime critics in and outside of Russia, often using nerve agents in the process. The most notable victim of this was Russian regime critic Alexei Navalny, who was allegedly poisoned by the Russian regime with the nerve agent Novichok and later on imprisoned in a Russian internment camp, ultimately resulting in his death in 2024 whilst still being imprisoned. This, in addition to Russia's annexation of Crimea, its engagement in the Ukraine war, its disinformation campaigns against EU countries as well as its support for anti-democratic movements and authoritarian regimes caused the EU to impose a wide array of sanctions against Russia, which in return led the relations between the two sides to sour. Europe also was increasingly at odds with the rising superpower China because of its human rights violations against the Uyghur minority, its treatment of Hong Kong, Chinese spying operations in the US and Europe, as well as its maritime claims in the South China Sea, leading various EU countries to take a more defiant approach against China as well. However, due to the close economic relationship between China and many European countries, Europe remained rather reluctant to oppose China significantly during the Second Cold War. Many Europeans who fought in WW3 later on saw it as a battle to protect freedom and democracy worldwide against the authoritarian influence of the revisionist powers and the threat of nuclear destruction, while also fighting for their political survival. While nations like Poland, the Baltics, Finland, and Norway joined to defend themselves from the Russian invasion, others hesitated to do so. France and the United Kingdom proved to be the only allies in Europe who were able to effectively support the US outside the continent, although Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Germany were able to give minor support to the North Africa Front and other non-European battlefields. Both the UK and France joined as the first European nations the Allied coalition of the US, due to their close political ties with America, their own conflicts with revisionist states and their own